Every clock in the city stopped at almost the same moment. Wristwatches on nightstands, the clock above the counter of a pharmacy on Avenida Roosevelt, the big face on the wall of a bank lobby that would not exist by morning. When rescuers began pulling them out of the rubble days later, they had all frozen within a minute of each other, somewhere around midnight, and every one of them was telling the same time on the same date, the 23rd of December, 1972. 2 days before Christmas, 15 seconds of shaking. That is all it took. Not a long earthquake, not even an especially large one by the standards of the century. 15 seconds, and the heart of a national capital simply ceased to exist. More than 600 city blocks, something close to 50,000 buildings, 13 square kilometers of downtown erased so completely that 20 years later, people were still driving across open fields where the busiest streets in Nicaragua used to be. And the number of people who died that night has never been settled. Not because nobody counted, because counting became impossible. The lowest serious estimates say 4,000. The highest figures, the ones written into Nicaraguan memory, say 19,320. Half a century later, the gap between those two numbers is still there, and everyone who studies this event understands why. A great many people were never found. They are still under the parking lots. Here is the part that is hardest to hold in your mind. 4 hours before it happened, Managua was having one of the best nights of its year. Shop windows were lit, restaurants were full, radios were playing Christmas music. Families were walking through the downtown arcades, finishing their last shopping, carrying bags, arguing about prices, promising to be home by midnight. And on the top floor of the Hotel Intercontinental, the pyramid-shaped building that looked down over the whole city, the richest man in the world was lying in a darkened room, awake. Howard Hughes had been hiding in Managua for months. Almost nobody knew. He had not been photographed in years. He did not leave his floor. He had staff who had worked for him for a decade and had never seen his face. And in 15 seconds, the Earth did what no journalist, no lawyer, and no government on the planet had managed to do. It drove Howard Hughes out of the building and into the open air, standing in the dark among strangers, watching a city burn. Within a day, he was gone from Nicaragua for good. The people in the street below him did not have that option. This is the story of the last ordinary night in the life of a city, and of what the 15 seconds that ended it set in motion. Because the earthquake did not only destroy Managua, what happened afterward, in the weeks and months when the aid started arriving, would eventually destroy the family that had ruled Nicaragua for more than 40 years. Nobody standing in the dust that night could have predicted that. But it began there. So let us go back a few hours to the evening when everything was still normal. It is Friday, the 22nd of December, 1972, and Managua does not look like a city on the edge of anything. The heat has not broken. It rarely does in December, and the air over the capital carries that particular mix of dust, engine exhaust, frying food, and music that anyone who lived there will describe the same way half a century later. It is the last Friday before Christmas. The shops are staying open late. The buses are packed. The lottery vendors are working the corners because people buy tickets in December the way they pray in December, out of a general hope that this year something might change. Managua at that moment holds somewhere around 400,000 people, and almost everything that matters in Nicaragua is concentrated in a small area near the shore of Lake Solotlan. The banks are there, the government ministries are there, the Grand Hotel, the cinemas, the market at the eastern edge, the cathedral with its 2 square towers, the pharmacies, the tailors, the shoe shops, the newspaper offices, the radio stations. Almost every family in the city has a reason to walk through those 20 or 30 blocks in the course of an ordinary week. That is not an incidental detail. That is the whole tragedy in a sentence. A country had put nearly everything it owned into a very small space. But on this particular Friday night, that concentration just looks like life. Downtown is where you go, so people go. Couples eat dinner, office parties spill onto the sidewalks. Somebody is getting married the following week, and the family is arguing about chairs. Children who have been let out of school for the holidays are being walked home late, half asleep, past strings of colored bulbs. Shopkeepers are counting the best receipts they've seen all year and thinking about next week, about January, about the extension they want to build. Under their feet, 4 or 5 kilometers down, a piece of rock that has been locked in place for decades is about 150 minutes away from letting go.
There is no warning. There will be no warning.
In 1972, nobody on Earth could give one. But it would be wrong to say that nobody knew this could happen, because that is not true either, and the difference matters. Nicaragua sits in one of the most seismically restless places in the Americas. A chain of volcanoes runs down the country like a spine. The ground moves constantly. Every generation of Managuans grew up with small tremors as part of ordinary life. The rattle of glass in a cabinet, a lamp swinging for a few seconds, a pause in conversation, then everyone going back to what they were doing. Children learned it as a kind of weather. Adults learned to make jokes about it. That familiarity is one of the strangest and most dangerous things a place can develop. When the ground moves 100 times without consequence, the 101st stops feeling like a possibility. Risk that never arrives stops registering as risk at all. People build, borrow, invest, plan, and quietly file the dangers somewhere behind the electricity bill. The specialists, though, understood something the public did not. Managua was not merely near a fault. Managua was built directly on top of a network of them. Not distant ruptures out under the ocean floor, not something in the mountains, cracks running underneath the streets themselves, underneath houses and schools and offices, some of them passing within meters of buildings where hundreds of people slept every night. Later investigation would identify several that moved that December: Tizcapa, Los Bancos, Chico Pelon, Escuelas. The Tizcapa fault runs beneath the hill where the presidential house stood, and the city already had the evidence because it had already happened. On the 31st of March, 1931, an earthquake of almost exactly the same character struck the same capital. Downtown collapsed. Then it burned for days because the water mains had broken and the fire equipment could not reach anything. Around 2,000 people were killed in a city that was then a fraction of the size it would later become. Survivors of that disaster were still alive in 1972. Some of them were grandparents telling the story to children who half believed it. But here is what happened in the 4 decades between the two catastrophes. Managua did not move. Managua did not fundamentally change how it built. Managua grew on the same ground, upward and outward, denser every year with more people, more concrete, more weight. And a great deal of what went up was, in engineering terms, close to the worst possible combination for a place like that. Walls of unreinforced masonry, brittle and heavy, carrying roofs and floors of solid concrete. Structures like that do not bend. They have no way of absorbing a violent horizontal shove. They stand, and then they come down all at once, and everything that was above you a moment ago is now on top of you. Engineers knew this. After the disaster, technical studies from American and international bodies would say plainly that the destruction was not a mystery of nature, but a predictable consequence of building that way on ground like that. Warnings, though, are cheap, and buildings are expensive. Rewriting a building code costs money. Enforcing one costs more, and it costs somebody powerful. In a capital where construction, land, and permits ran through a small circle of families connected to the government, an inconvenient warning had a way of becoming a document in a drawer. So the city kept rising, and the fault kept loading, and the two processes ignored each other completely. There is one more detail from that Friday that almost nobody thinks about until they hear it, and then they never forget it. Managua's 2 main fire stations were downtown, one in the Candelaria neighborhood, one near the National Stadium. They had been placed there for the obvious reason, which is that downtown is where the fires are. Both buildings were of the same era and the same construction as everything around them. Both would collapse in the first 15 seconds, with the crews and the trucks inside. The city's ability to fight fire would be destroyed in the same instant that the fires began. That single fact, more than any other, explains the shape of the night that was coming. But nobody knew that yet. On Friday night, the trucks were parked, the crews were on duty, and downtown Managua was full of people finishing their Christmas shopping. The last hours passed the way last hours always do, which is to say, indistinguishably from any others. Restaurants closed. Social clubs kept going a while longer because it was December and there was music. Buses made their final runs. Night watchmen took up positions outside the shops. In the hospitals, the night shift settled in. In the jails, in El Hormiguero and the old aviation prison, guards counted heads and locked up. Families came home and turned off the lights.
By around midnight, the streets were emptying out. The lights on the buildings were still on. It was warm. Somewhere a radio was still playing. 12:29 in the morning, according to the seismographs. Around 12:35, according to the clocks in the city. The gap between those two figures is itself a small piece of history, and it is never fully closed. The instruments recorded one time. The clocks, the newspapers, and the memories of the people who lived through it recorded another. What is not in dispute is that it came just past midnight in the first hour of the 23rd of December, when nearly every person in the capital was in bed. What people felt first was not a rumble. It was a hit. Survivors describe it almost identically again and again. The sensation of being struck from underneath, not a swaying, not a rolling motion building gradually, but a single violent blow delivered upward through the mattress, the floor, the whole house at once, as if something enormous beneath the city had shoved it. Some people were thrown out of bed before they were fully awake. Some were awake and could not stand up. The epicenter was almost directly under the capital, and it was shallow. That is the entire explanation for what followed. An earthquake of magnitude 6.2 or 6.3, depending on the catalog, is a serious event, but not a monster. There are dozens of them around the world every year, and most of them break some windows. This one released its energy a few kilometers under a densely populated city built out of brittle masonry and heavy concrete along faults that ran through the neighborhoods themselves. That is how a moderate earthquake becomes one of the worst urban catastrophes in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The instrumental record says the strong shaking lasted somewhere between 10 and 15 seconds. Ask anyone who was there, and they will tell you 30. Both numbers are true in their own way. The newspapers of the time seized on the second one, and a phrase went around the world that Nicaraguans have never let go of. In 30 seconds, only Hiroshima and Managua. Inside those seconds, this is what happened. The masonry went first. Walls that had no reinforcement to hold them together simply lost cohesion, and the heavy concrete they had been carrying came straight down. Buildings did not topple sideways in the way people imagine from films. Many of them dropped, floor onto floor, in a few heartbeats, leaving a low pile of slabs and dust where a 3-story structure had been. Windows exploded inward, ceilings came apart, furniture crossed rooms. The people who survived the first 3 seconds usually did so because they were in a doorway, under something solid, or lucky in a way that has no explanation. The power grid failed almost immediately, and Managua went completely dark. Not dim, dark. No streetlights, no house lights, no traffic signals, no illuminated signs, nothing but whatever moonlight got through what was now an enormous cloud of pulverized concrete and plaster hanging over the center of the city. And then it stopped. What came next is the thing survivors have the hardest time describing, because there is no silence in it. From under the rubble, voices began. People calling their children by name, people answering, people asking from inside collapsed houses whether anyone was out there. In some streets you could hear a dozen conversations happening between the living above and the living below, in total darkness, with nothing available to dig with except hands. Nobody understood the size of it. That is the detail people always underestimate. There was no way to know. There was no electricity, the telephone system was crippled, and you could not see more than a few meters through the dust. A man standing in front of his own flattened house in one neighborhood had no way of knowing whether this was his street, his district, or his entire country. Many assumed it was local. Many assumed help was already coming from downtown. Downtown was gone. Then, less than an hour later, the ground moved twice more. At 18 minutes past 1, a shock of magnitude 5.0. 2 minutes after that, at 20 minutes past 1, another at 5.2. In ordinary circumstances, those are minor events. On top of buildings that had just been shaken to the edge of collapse, they finished the job on structures that it held, and they did something worse. They made every survivor in the city understand that it was not over. Nobody would go back indoors after that. Not that night, not the next night, and in many cases not for weeks. Parks, plazas, courtyards, the middle of avenues, the outfield of a baseball diamond, any flat piece of ground away from a wall became a refugee camp within an hour of the first shock. Tens of thousands of people sat down in the open and waited for daylight, wearing whatever they had been sleeping in. And then the fires started.
They started everywhere at once, for reasons that were entirely predictable and entirely unstoppable. Electrical lines had been torn down while still live. Gas cylinders had ruptured in 1,000 kitchens. Fuel tanks had split. Cooking fires and candles met collapsed wooden structures that had been drying out through a long stretch of drought. Within an hour, the center of the city was burning in a dozen separate places, and the separate places were beginning to join up. There was almost nothing anyone could do about it. Both downtown fire stations were under their own rubble. The water mains had broken in the first seconds, so even the equipment that survived had nothing to pump. Whole blocks that had partially survived the shaking burned to the ground through the rest of that night and into the following days. Some fires in the ruins of Managua were still being fought 2 weeks later, into the first week of January. For the people sitting in the plazas, the fire became the only light in the city. That is how many of them finally understood the scale of what had happened, not by being told, but by watching the glow spread along a skyline they had known their whole lives and seeing which shapes were missing from it. There were losses inside that night that most accounts skip over. The General Hospital, the main public hospital of the capital, was wrecked in the first seconds with patients and staff inside. The city lost most of its capacity to treat the injured at the exact moment it acquired something like 20,000 of them. 2 hospitals of better construction, the military hospital and the Vélez País, survived, and for days they absorbed a flood of casualties far beyond anything they were built for. Doctors worked by flashlight and car headlights, operating on floors and in corridors. Ordinary drivers turned their cars into ambulances and kept driving until the fuel ran out. The prisons collapsed too. In El Hormiguero, police officers and prisoners died together under the same walls. In the old aviation prison, the death toll ran to around 100. Men locked in cells had no chance at all, and their deaths were among the least documented of the night. And through all of it, in every neighborhood, the same scene repeated itself thousands of times. Neighbors who barely knew each other lifting concrete together, families digging with bare hands and kitchen tools, people shouting for quiet so they could listen for an answer from underneath. Almost every rescue that happened in the first 12 hours was performed by ordinary people with nothing, because no organized rescue existed to be called. Then the sky started to get light, and Managua found out what had happened to it. Dawn on the 23rd of December did not bring relief. It brought comprehension, which was worse. In the first gray light, people climbed onto whatever was high and looked around, and the geography of their own city stopped making sense. The buildings that told you where you were had either come down or been reduced to shapes nobody could identify. People got lost within a few hundred meters of their own front doors. 13 square kilometers of the center were effectively destroyed. Around 27 square kilometers were badly damaged. Something like 9 out of every 10 commercial buildings downtown were gone or unusable. Ministries, banks, the newspaper offices, the cinemas, the hotels, the shops, the schools. Whole institutions of Nicaraguan public life disappeared in one night, along with their records, their archives, and a great many of the people who ran them. And standing in the middle of that, almost untouched, was a 19-story tower. The Banco de America building had been designed and built to resist earthquakes. Not as a gesture, but properly as a piece of engineering. It came through the night essentially intact, and for years afterward it stood over the ruins like an argument that nobody in authority wanted to have out loud, because it demonstrated something unbearable. This had not been unavoidable. The knowledge existed, the techniques existed. They had been applied to one bank. A few other structures made the same point. The Rubén Darío National Theater, newly built with modern seismic design, survived and became a shelter and a coordination point. The Hotel Intercontinental on its own hill survived and became the headquarters for the press and the aid agencies. In a city of rubble, the buildings that lived were, with very few exceptions, the buildings that had been designed by people who took the fault lines seriously. The Cathedral of Santiago, which had stood at the center of the capital's public life, did not fall. It was worse than that. It was broken open and rendered permanently unusable, and it has never been rebuilt or torn down. It is still standing today, empty, roofless in places, with weeds growing out of it, in the middle of a modern city. 50 years on, the largest surviving object in Managua is the hole the earthquake left. By that first afternoon, the survivors were doing what always happens after a disaster of this size.
They were looking for each other. People walked from one improvised aid post to the next, reading handwritten lists of names. Churches and the schools that it held became gathering points. Messages were chalked onto walls and pinned to trees. Families split up to search different districts and agreed to meet at nightfall, and some of them met there for weeks. Meanwhile, the government of Nicaragua was making the first of the decisions that would define everything that came afterward. Martial law was declared. Jeeps of the National Guard moved through the ruined center with loudspeakers announcing it. The official position, stated openly, was that the most urgent problem facing the capital was not the injured or the fires, but the looters, and the Guard was authorized to deal with them accordingly. General Anastasio Somoza de Baile later acknowledged that looters had been shot. There is a complication here that matters enormously for what follows. At that moment, Somoza was not formally the president. He had stepped back from the office under a political arrangement that left a governing junta nominally in charge, while he retained what actually counted, which was command of the National Guard. Within hours of the earthquake, he installed himself as head of the National Emergency Committee, and from that position he ran the country directly again. The disaster did not merely happen under his rule. It handed him back his rule in front of everybody. And then the world started to arrive. The images went out fast, and they were extraordinary. A capital city on fire, a downtown reduced to slabs, hundreds of thousands of people sleeping in the open 2 days before Christmas. The response was immediate and, by the standards of the time, enormous. Aircraft began landing with food, water, medicine, plasma, tents, blankets, and heavy equipment. Rescue and medical teams came in from across the Americas and from Europe. What is remarkable, looking back, is who sent help at the same time: the United States and the Soviet Union. Cuba and Taiwan, Israel, Mexico, Spain, Japan, Costa Rica, Venezuela. In a world that in 1972 agreed on almost nothing, Managua was briefly the one thing everybody agreed on. Ordinary people gave too, in a way that has few parallels. Money was collected in schools and churches on 3 continents. In Los Angeles, the Rolling Stones played a benefit concert for the victims and raised a very large sum for the relief effort. The connection was personal as well as public. Mick Jagger's wife, Bianca, had been born and raised in Managua, and she went back into the ruined city in the days after the earthquake to look for her own family. Tens of millions of dollars in aid and mountains of supplies poured into a country of barely 2 million people. For an enormous number of survivors, that help was the difference between living and dying. The tents that went up in the camps came off those planes. So did the water, the antibiotics, the vaccines that stopped the outbreaks everyone was expecting, and the food that kept several 100,000 newly homeless people alive through January. And almost immediately, the reports started. Journalists in the camps noticed that supplies unloaded at the airport were not turning up where they were supposed to. Businessmen watched reconstruction contracts go without competition to companies owned by people connected to the presidential family. Relief goods appeared for sale in markets. Building materials donated for emergency housing ended up on private projects. Land that suddenly needed to be bought for the new city turned out, in a striking number of cases, to already belong to the right people. Some of the specific accusations from that period remain contested and always will, because the archives of a regime that fell in a revolution are not a tidy source. But the broad picture is not seriously disputed by historians of modern Nicaragua. The relief effort was systematically exploited by the circle around Somoza, and the country watched it happen. Nothing the regime had done in decades cost it as much as this did. Understand the position ordinary Nicaraguans were in. They had lost family members whose bodies were never recovered, and lost their houses, their savings, and their jobs in a single night. They were living in a tent in a field, standing in line for water, and they were being told by people arriving from abroad that generous quantities of help had been sent for them. Help they could see was not reaching them, while new commercial buildings went up on land owned by the president's associates. The reaction was not only anger among the poor, which the regime had survived before. The decisive thing was that this time it reached the people who had always propped the family up. Business owners who had lost everything downtown and watched the reconstruction contracts go to insiders. Professionals. Parts of the Catholic Church, which was running relief operations of its own, and could see exactly where the supplies were going. The private sector and the middle class began, gradually and then not gradually,
to conclude that the arrangement they had tolerated for 2 generations was no longer tolerable.
There is one story from those weeks that says more than any statistic.
Roberto Clemente was one of the greatest baseball players who ever lived, an icon in Puerto Rico and across Latin America, and he had a personal connection to Managua, having been there only weeks before the earthquake. When the disaster happened, he threw himself into organizing relief, raising money and loading aircraft himself. Then he learned that the shipments were being intercepted, that what he was sending was not reaching the people it was meant for. His response was to decide that he would go with the next flight in person, on the reasoning that the supplies would not be stolen if he was standing next to them. On the 31st of December, 1972, the last night of that terrible year, the aircraft he had chartered took off from San Juan, overloaded, with a history of mechanical problems. It crashed into the sea within minutes of leaving the runway. Everyone aboard was killed. Clemente's body was never recovered.
He was 38 years old, and he died because he did not trust a government to hand out food.
The rebuilding of Managua turned out to be a different kind of problem from anything the country had faced, and the solution the city arrived at was one that nobody chose. The obvious approach, the one most cities take, is to clear the center and put it back. Managua could not do that, and the reason was geological rather than political. The faults ran directly under the old downtown. Rebuilding a dense city center on top of active surface ruptures would have been an act of deliberate self-harm, and restrictions were placed on construction in the worst zones. So the center was demolished, the rubble was hauled away over years, and then, for the most part, nothing was built there at all. Managua did not rebuild its heart. Managua grew around the hole. Commerce moved outward and scattered. New neighborhoods appeared on the southern edges. Shopping districts, government offices, and residential zones ended up separated from each other by kilometers of low sprawl. What had been the busiest ground in the country became grass, empty lots, and parking, and it stayed that way for the better part of 20 years, with serious reconstruction of the area only beginning in the 1990s. This is why Managua is, to this day, one of the most unusual capital cities in Latin America. Almost every other city on the continent grew out from a colonial plaza that is still the center of everything. Managua has an absence where that should be. Visitors notice it within an hour of arriving and often cannot work out what they are looking at. The people who lived there dealt with this in a way that is, depending on your mood, either heartbreaking or magnificent. They kept the old city as a map. Managua never adopted a normal system of street names and numbers. Addresses in the capital are given by direction and distance from a landmark using an old local compass in which north is toward the lake, south is up, east is where the sun comes from, and west is where it goes down. That system predates the earthquake. What the earthquake did was remove the landmarks, and the city responded by refusing to give them up, so the addresses stayed in the past tense. To this day, a Managuan will tell you to go 2 blocks toward the lake from where the mango tree used to be. Businesses print addresses on their cards that reference a cinema demolished before their owners were born, a pharmacy that burned in 1972, a tree that was cut down decades ago, a factory that no longer exists. Taxi drivers navigate flawlessly by a network of things that are not there. Foreigners find it maddening. Delivery apps have had to be redesigned around it. But look at what it actually is. It is a whole population, most of whom were born after the disaster, giving each other directions through a city that was destroyed before they existed. The buildings were taken away. The map in people's heads was not. Every time somebody in Managua says where something used to be, the old city is being spoken back into existence for a moment by people who never saw it. That is not nostalgia. That is a form of stubbornness, and it is the reason this story does not simply end in rubble. The human consequences ran on for decades, mostly out of sight. Emergency camps hardened into settlements, and settlements hardened into permanent neighborhoods on the outskirts, some without proper water or sewage for years. Families who had owned a shop for 3 generations became families who owned nothing. Many left the capital for other parts of Nicaragua, and a very large number left the country entirely. And the political fuse that had been lit in the aid camps kept burning. The regime never recovered the legitimacy it burned that winter. The alliance of convenience that had kept the Somoza family in power for more than 40 years, the arrangement in which the business class and the church tolerated the arrangement because it was stable and profitable, came apart in the years after the earthquake. Opposition that had been marginal became broad. Armed insurgency that had been a fringe irritant became a national movement with mainstream sympathy and mainstream funding. 7 years after the night the clock stopped, in 1979, the Somoza dynasty fell, and Anastasio Somoza Debayle fled the country. The dynasty had held power in Nicaragua for 43 years. It did not survive the decade that began with those 15 seconds. It would be too simple to say that an earthquake overthrew a government. Revolutions have long roots, and the grievances that produced this one existed well before 1972. What is fair to say, and what historians of the period do say, is this: the earthquake stripped the paint off. It showed an entire population, all at once and in the most personal way imaginable, exactly how their state behaved when everything was at stake. Nothing else in 40 years had made the case so clearly, or to so many people at the same time. More than 50 years have passed. The Managua that exists now is a living city of well over 1 million people, and most of them have no personal memory of any of this. It has grown in directions the old capital never imagined, with districts that did not exist and roads that run where there were fields. But it is not finished with that night, and the evidence is everywhere. It is in the empty ground near the lake, and in the broken cathedral, standing in the middle of it with grass growing in the nave, kept as it fell because nobody could bring themselves to erase it, and nobody could figure out how to bring it back. It is in the addresses, in every set of directions given from a landmark that stopped existing before the person speaking was born. It is in the buildings, because Nicaragua does now build differently, and the reason it builds differently is written in the casualty figures of 1972. And it is in the families, the ones who dug through the night with their hands, the ones who left and raised children abroad with a version of Managua in their heads that no longer matches any place on earth, and the ones who never found the person they were looking for and had to go on anyway with a grave that was really just a location. What happened in Managua was not, in the end, an unusually large earthquake. That is the part worth carrying away from it. It was a moderate shock at a shallow depth under a city that had been warned, that had already been destroyed once in living memory, and that had spent 40 years building the wrong way on top of the reason. 15 seconds of moving ground did not make that outcome. 40 years of decisions did. The ground only collected. The old Managua ended just after midnight on the 23rd of December 1972, with the shop windows still lit behind it, and Christmas 2 days off. What replaced it is a city that never got its center back, that navigates by things that are gone, and that remembers with a persistence that has outlasted the concrete. Because a city does not really disappear when its buildings fall down. It disappears when people stop saying its name. And in Managua, half a century later, they are still giving each other directions to a city that no longer exists.